Daniel Clark hadn't planned on being a savior that morning. He was simply walking his dog Murphy down the old logging trail, as he did every sunrise for the last 3 years. The early Oregon mist clung to the trees like a secret, and the ground was slick with last night's rain. There was a heaviness in the air, not weather, but something else. Daniel felt it in his bones, the way war veterans sometimes do when the silence starts to ring too loud. Since returning from Mars, where half his unit had vanished into red storms and radiation shadows, he had withdrawn from the noise of cities and screens. His world had become smaller, but more alive. The forest spoke to him. The wind hummed lullabies through the trees. And the river, always the river, reminded him of time's endless pull forward, whether or not anyone was ready. It started with a shriek that wasn't animal. Not here, not earth animal, at least. Murphy froze. His ears stood up, growling, low and deliberate. Daniel turned his head toward the riverbank, where the sound had come from. Something was thrashing violently in the water. He dropped to a crouch instinctively, feeling that soldier's reflex surge back after years of disuse. He crept forward. What he saw would not make sense to most. A large creature, feline in shape, yet armored with layered scales that shimmered with unnatural light, was half submerged in the river. Its paws, massive and clawed, flailed for traction. Its snout was short and feline, but its eyes glowed silver, even in panic. It was drowning. Without thinking, Daniel leapt in. The cold hit like a punch, but training took over. He wrapped his arms under the creature's forelimbs and heaved with every ounce of strength. It thrashed once, violently, then went limp. He dragged it out onto the bank, lungs burning, heart pounding, and collapsed beside it. Murphy barked, confused, scared. Daniel forced himself up on an elbow, wiping water and mud from his eyes. The creature wasn't breathing. He checked its chest, no rise, no fall. His instincts screamed that this was foolish, that this being could kill him if it woke, but he started chest compressions. He remembered enough field medic work to know rhythm mattered. 30 presses. Check for breath. Nothing. Again. Press. 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 A hacking sound. The creature jerked violently, coughing up water tinged with bioluminescent blood. Its chest began to rise and fall slowly. Alive. Daniel sat back, trembling. What had he just done? The creature was unlike anything recorded, not a known alien race, not any of the 100 catalogued species humanity had encountered since first contact 15 years ago. Its body shimmered in the light, changing slightly with every breath it took. But most disturbing of all was what it held against its chest, even while unconscious. A pod. Small, fragile, and pulsating softly. It wasn't technology. It was alive. And Daniel could feel it, somehow, reaching toward him. His eyes met Murphy's, and even the old Labrador seemed changed by what they'd seen. The creature stirred. One eye opened, fixing on Daniel. Pain, fear, and then recognition swam in its gaze. But more than anything, there was something deeply human in that moment, gratitude. Daniel moved slowly, raising his hands. "You're safe," he whispered, as if the words would somehow reach across whatever boundary separated their minds. The creature did not move, but its gaze shifted down to the pod. It pushed the object toward Daniel with a weak nudge. He didn't touch it. Something told him this wasn't a gift. It was a request. The pod pulsed again, like a heartbeat. As Daniel leaned in, a whisper filled his ears, though there was no sound. Images, maybe? Emotions. He saw fire falling from alien skies. Worlds collapsing. A scream across time, not from a voice, but from a soul. He staggered back, clutching his chest. The pod hadn't spoken, but it had shared. Pain, immense and cosmic. Fear that wrapped itself around his spine like a noose. And something else. Hope. Fragile, flickering hope. Daniel glanced at the creature, now unconscious again. Whatever this thing was, it hadn't come to harm Earth. It had come to save whatever was inside that pod. And Daniel had pulled it from death's mouth. A breeze rustled the trees, cold and warning. The hairs on Daniel's arms rose. Something wasn't right. He stood slowly, cradling the pod. Looking down at the wounded being beside him, he felt that old voice rise again, the one that once shouted orders over Martian gunfire, the one that kept him breathing through the nights no one else survived. That voice whispered now, calmly but urgently. Protect it. Not because it was alien. Not because it was part of some great cosmic war. But because it was alive. Because it mattered to someone. Because that's what humans did when no one else would. Murphy barked again, sharper this time. Something deep in the woods snapped, a branch under weight. They weren't alone. Daniel scanned the tree-line. Mist thickened unnaturally, coiling like fingers. And in that silence, deeper than any night he'd ever known, he felt a presence, watching. He bent down, lifted the creature with a grunt, and began moving back toward the cabin. The pod he tucked carefully inside his jacket, against his chest. Its pulse aligned with his heartbeat. He didn't know what it was. He didn't know what would come next. But something ancient stirred within him. Not fear. Not confusion. Purpose. And for the first time since Mars, Daniel Clark knew exactly what he had to do. Daniel didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. Every breath he took felt unnatural, as if the air itself had changed since he touched the alien pod. He'd placed the creature, he still didn't know its name or species, on a mattress near the fire. Blankets draped over its frame barely concealed the shimmer of its armored skin. It hadn't moved since the collapse by the river, but the pod in Daniel's possession hadn't stopped pulsing. Not once. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. It simply existed at the center of his chest like a second heartbeat. The strange emotional resonance he'd felt earlier returned at intervals, bringing flickers of thoughts that weren't his. He saw cities lit by suns he didn't recognize. He saw people, some humanoid, some not, fleeing unseen horrors, clutching similar pods. A pattern. A message. A warning. He stayed near the window most of the night, rifle in hand. Something had followed them back from the woods. He didn't need proof. His instincts had saved him during the colonial skirmishes on Jupiter's moons, and they were screaming now. Not from paranoia, but precision. At dawn, the creature finally stirred. Its movements were weak but deliberate, as if it had trained its body to suppress pain until absolutely necessary. Its eyes opened again, locking onto Daniel, and the smallest nod passed between them. Daniel had seen warriors recognize each other like that before. He wasn't dealing with some lost animal. This being had fought for something. Lost for something. And he had interrupted that death. It lifted one paw and traced a shape into the floor, 3 diagonal lines, intersected by a circle. The symbol meant nothing to Daniel, but he felt its weight. It wasn't random. The creature tapped the floor beside the drawing and then touched the pod. Not a gift. Not a request. A duty. Daniel sat down and removed the pod from his jacket, placing it on the table between them. For a moment, the room dimmed as if light itself recoiled. The pod reacted to proximity, releasing a small pulse that made the fire flicker. The creature blinked slowly, deliberately, and Daniel understood. Whatever this pod was protecting wasn't just valuable. It was sacred. And he had been chosen to guard it. The silence stretched. Daniel finally said, "Are there more coming for it?" The creature's gaze dropped to the floor, and then it gave the faintest hiss. Not a threat. A lament. Daniel didn't need translation. He'd seen that kind of expression after mass casualty strikes. Survivors carrying ashes instead of names. Then it stood, unsteady but focused. It walked toward the window and stared out into the forest. Daniel watched it tilt its head slightly, then growl, a low, almost imperceptible rumble. Something was close. He followed its line of sight and saw nothing. But he trusted it. He reached into the cabinet, pulling out the old signal disruptor from his Mars days and set it on low power. If anything out there was using standard tracking frequencies, it'd go blind in a 10-mile radius. The creature looked at the device, then at Daniel, and gave a grunt. Acknowledgement. Approval. Daniel wasn't just guarding it now. They were in this together. By mid-morning, strange things began happening. The birds in the woods had gone silent. No wind moved the trees. And then his solar-powered sensor grid, built to warn of approaching wildlife, lit up like a fireworks display. Every perimeter line had tripped at once. But nothing showed on the cameras. He moved with discipline, checking weapons, securing the doors, fortifying weak points. The cabin had once been his escape. Now it was a bunker. He set emergency rations near the safe room and filled extra canteens. Old habits came alive, sharp and fluid. The creature moved beside him, mimicking some of his actions with an eerie synchronicity. It didn't need explanation. It had fought sieges before. Together, they reinforced the cabin's vulnerable edges. Together, they prepared. By late afternoon, the sky shifted to a bruised gray-green. Clouds rolled faster than weather should allow. Daniel knew artificial disturbances when he saw them. Something was manipulating local conditions. He stared at the horizon and felt the pull of dread. Not for himself. For what the pod meant. Whatever was coming, it wasn't here for a fight, it was here to retrieve or destroy. And it wouldn't ask questions. The pod suddenly began to glow more brightly. The creature snarled and stepped in front of it, body low and protective. Then it turned to Daniel and, with immense effort, placed a clawed paw on his chest. For a moment, Daniel wasn't in the cabin. He stood on a broken world made of glass and fire. Towers lay in ruin. Skies burned violet. Above, a void moved, not a ship, not a being. A force. Cold, consuming, hollow. The creature beside him was younger in this vision, armored in honor markings, standing among a handful of others, each carrying a pod. They were running. Fleeing a collapsing order. Their task wasn't to fight. It was to preserve something unspeakably important. The last of a mind, a legacy, a species? The pod held knowledge, soul, memory. Daniel couldn't define it exactly, but he felt it to his core. He snapped back to reality, gasping. The creature's eyes were heavy with sorrow. This was their final stand. They hadn't expected to survive. But now, Daniel was in the way. He'd saved what shouldn't have survived. He whispered, "You trusted me." It nodded, slow and sure. The trees outside bent slightly, though no wind moved. Shadows coalesced. Something had arrived. Not seen, but felt. Daniel felt pressure on his temples, like hands trying to pry open his mind. He resisted, gripping the pod. It flared gently in his arms, a whisper of defiance against the horror at the edge of the woods. He turned to the creature, hands steady. "We hold. We protect." The creature answered with a soft growl. Either of them ran. Daniel moved with quiet determination. The wind had changed again, this time carrying a scent he couldn't place. Not blood, not decay, something stranger. It was as if the air was laced with static, and every breath crackled against his lungs. The creature followed close behind, its pace slower now, not from injury, but from restraint. Every step it took seemed calculated, as if each movement triggered buried instincts. The moment of calm was brief. From the treeline, reality folded. Not burst, not shattered, folded. The edges of space seemed to pull inward, revealing something that wasn't supposed to exist. Shapes bled into vision, tall, skeletal things with skin like shadows and faces that reflected nothing. They made no noise. They radiated absence. Daniel's instincts screamed to run, but something deeper inside rooted him to the floor. The creature growled, not with fear, but fury. It knew them. Daniel could see it in its eyes. These weren't random pursuers. These were the reason the pod existed. They didn't want it destroyed. They wanted it consumed. Erased. Not just physically, but spiritually. Whatever culture the alien had come from, it had been hunted, not conquered. Daniel raised his rifle. It wouldn't be enough, he knew that. He fired anyway. The shadows reacted, bending around the impact like liquid. Not hurt, but slowed. Disrupted. The creature launched forward with surprising strength and knocked one of the entities back. Its claws didn't tear flesh, they disrupted form. That was the trick. These things weren't bodies. They were echoes of something worse. Daniel grabbed the disruptor and cranked it to maximum. The pulse waves surged outward, scattering the air like a physical blow. One of the entities disassembled mid-stride, a mass of writhing static and crackling silence, but the others kept coming. Then the pod pulsed. Not just light this time, but memory. Sound. A vibration so pure it silenced thought. Daniel dropped to one knee, clutching his chest. Images burst across his vision, languages not his, but felt. Names of stars that sang instead of burned. A deep, overwhelming presence like a mother cradling the universe. The pod wasn't just technology, it was sentient, or close to it. It wasn't defending itself. It was trying to remind the universe of what had been lost. The creatures hesitated. For the first time, they looked unsure. Not stopped, but stalled. The creature, the alien leopard, took the moment. It leapt across the clearing, not to attack, but to drag one of the shadows directly into the pod's radiant field. What happened next wasn't violent. It was quiet. The shadow rippled, shuddered, and then simply ceased. Like a wrong note being corrected by silence. Daniel stared. He had never seen an enemy defeated without force. This was different. This was preservation overwhelming destruction. But more came. Dozens. Hundreds, maybe. Reality tore again as new forms appeared, larger, more stable. They weren't shadows. They had mass now. Armor, perhaps. Adaptations? Daniel realized they had learned. They evolved. And they wanted the pod before it adapted further. He turned to the creature, breath short. We can't hold this alone. The creature stared at him, then blinked once. A pause, and then it opened its jaw. Sound emerged. Not growling. Not alien speech. It was harmony, 6 tones rising like a beacon. The pod responded instantly. Light erupted, and somewhere beyond vision, something awoke. There was a distant, pulsing echo in the sky, like drums in reverse. Then clouds shifted and a circular formation burned itself into the atmosphere. It wasn't a ship, not exactly. But it was alive. Daniel could feel it even from miles away. Something had heard the call. The shadows began to retreat, slowly at first. Then rapidly. Not out of fear, but strategy. They'd failed. They would try again. And next time, they'd bring more. Daniel collapsed to the ground, exhausted. His hands trembled, the adrenaline gone. The creature sat beside him, shoulder brushing his. No words were needed. They both knew what came next. The pod no longer glowed. It shimmered. Its shape had subtly changed, as though it had grown in understanding. It had learned from them. From the stand they made. The sky continued pulsing with light, and then a beam of energy landed not far from the cabin. No explosion. No tremor. Just presence. Something emerged, a figure, tall and covered in ornate armor that bent the eye. Not human, but familiar. Another survivor? A guardian? It approached slowly. The leopard moved forward, standing between it and Daniel. But the figure raised an open palm and removed its helmet. Female. Graceful. Tired. She spoke without words. Her voice was felt. She had come for the pod. Not to claim it, but to carry it forward. Its journey had not ended here. It had only begun. Daniel stood. He handed the pod over without resistance. For a moment, the pod hesitated in his grasp, as if reluctant to leave. But it accepted the transfer. The figure looked at Daniel, nodded once, and turned. She vanished into the light. The leopard did not follow. Daniel turned toward it, confused. But it simply sat down. Then it placed a paw on its chest and nodded toward him. The meaning struck him slowly. The pod had been preserved. The war was not over. But its guardian's role was done. Now Daniel would take its place. Not as warrior. As witness. Daniel sat alone in the quiet aftermath, his thoughts moving like heavy smoke through the wreckage of the world he thought he knew. What had started as a rescue had now become something far more complex. The alien leopard remained close, silent and still, like a sentinel who no longer had a command but could not let go of duty. The forest around them was hushed, unnaturally so. Even the birds that once filled the canopy with their restless songs had fallen silent, sensing the invisible change in reality. The pod was gone. Carried by something ancient and vast, an intelligence that didn't speak in words but memories and frequencies. Yet its presence lingered, like a scent on the wind or a half-forgotten melody that played at the edges of consciousness. Daniel kept seeing flashes behind his eyes, mountains from alien worlds, songs sung not with mouths but with stars, and pain. The kind of pain civilizations feel when they are silenced, not just destroyed. His body ached, not from wounds but the weight of what he now knew. The silence between him and the leopard wasn't awkward, it was reverent. They had shared something few in the universe ever would, survival at the edge of something ancient, horrific, and cold. The creatures that had tried to consume the pod were not simple predators. They were the antithesis of life. Not evil, but anti-being. They erased not to gain power, but because existence itself offended them. And they would come again. This had been one encounter in a war too vast for any single species to fight alone. Daniel rose slowly. The leopard followed. It was no longer injured, and something in its movements had changed. Not domesticated but aware. Every glance it gave him held a quiet intelligence. Not human, but not alien in the way most people feared. Daniel didn't need words anymore. There was shared understanding. The creature had watched its kin die. It had guarded something precious for longer than he could imagine. And now, it had chosen not to follow the pod. It had chosen to remain on Earth. The U.S. military response came 2 days later. A reconnaissance drone picked up the unnatural geometric burns in the sky and sent coordinates. Black trucks arrived without insignia, armed men in heavy armor carrying instruments instead of rifles. They were scientists, linguists, a few agents Daniel suspected weren't entirely human themselves. But none of them were prepared for the story he told. Most didn't believe it. They wrote him off as an unstable witness suffering from psychosis or trauma-induced hallucination. But they couldn't explain the creature. They tried to sedate it. It didn't work. It simply stood still, letting them try, then moved to sit beside Daniel when it was over. That act alone changed minds. This was not a wild animal. It was a guardian. A diplomat, maybe? Something far older than what humans had terms for. Eventually, the scientists stopped trying to contain the story and started listening. The forest was cordoned off, but Daniel was allowed to stay. They needed him. Not because he was special, but because he had been chosen, by the leopard, and indirectly by the pod. It was less about what he had done and more about what he had endured. Data flowed in. The burns on the trees weren't from any known weapon. The soil near the pod's original location now contained isotopes not native to Earth. The pulse he had released from the disruptor was recorded by satellites halfway across the planet. It wasn't just energy, it had carried a pattern. A warning. Or maybe an invitation. Other governments began asking questions. Some sent envoys. Others tried to interfere. But every attempt to claim authority over the site failed, not because of politics or weapons, but because of the leopard. It made no sound, issued no threats, but its presence was undeniable. Anyone who tried to act with arrogance found themselves watched, their confidence eroded by a gaze that seemed to weigh every intention. The U.S. made the only reasonable decision: cooperation. Daniel was debriefed, questioned, analyzed. They mapped his memories, ran tests, tried to translate what the pod had shown him. They didn't find direct answers, but they found patterns, vibrational harmonics that matched pulses from deep space anomalies logged decades ago. In short, Earth had been noticed long before the pod crashed. The encounter wasn't an accident. It was a test. And humanity had passed, barely. Word leaked to certain corners of the scientific community. Conspiracy theories exploded. But nothing concrete made it to public news. Not because it was suppressed, because no one who hadn't seen the truth could truly understand it. The facts didn't add up to a headline. There was no invasion, no dead aliens, no technology to reverse engineer. Just a man, a creature, and a field of burned silence. Daniel was offered a role. Not military, not political. Something in between. A liaison. An observer. A reluctant ambassador to the unknown. He accepted, not because he craved the responsibility, but because there was no one else the Leopard would follow. They built a facility near the impact zone, but off-site enough to preserve the forest. Daniel insisted the environment stay untouched. He wasn't a conservationist by profession, but something about the land felt sacred now. The team agreed. The Leopard wandered freely, returning to Daniel's side whenever something new arrived, a probe, a question, a dream. The dreams had started, faint at first. Flickers. Then full moments. Daniel began seeing places he'd never been, but knew. Hearing voices that spoke in chords. Feeling emotions that were not his own. It was the pod, still reaching. The bond wasn't broken. It was growing. He no longer feared the shadows. He feared forgetting. That the world might move on and bury what had happened under bureaucracy and denial. He feared humanity's short attention span. But as long as the Leopard stayed, as long as he remembered, there would be a chance. A chance for Earth to be more than just a blue dot. A chance for it to become part of something vaster, deeper, ancient. A chance to prove that in the cold darkness between stars, kindness still mattered. The world did not end, but it changed. Quietly, without the drama of public announcements or viral headlines, the axis of human understanding shifted. Daniel became a name that passed in whispers among those who handled classified briefings and sat in echoless rooms beneath the surface of the earth. He never asked for it. The truth had touched him in a way no amount of explanation or narrative control could alter. The Leopard still remained at his side, not as a pet, nor a protector, but as a witness. It aged, visibly and yet gracefully, as though it had more control over time than biology. The bond between man and being had become something unspoken and eternal. There were no more tests. There was no longer a need. Daniel returned to a life that resembled normality, but was never truly normal again. His home was no longer the same house he had built. It had become a structure on the edge of what government scientists now quietly called the verge, an undefined boundary around the pod's original site where space and time still fluctuated on instruments. The verge wasn't dangerous, not anymore, but it was revered. Nothing lived inside it, yet plants grew there faster, more vibrant. Sometimes people claimed they saw shapes moving inside, like echoes of a different world. The military maintained a quiet presence, far enough not to intimidate but close enough to respond if needed. The rest of the country, and the world, moved on unaware. The official explanation remained a meteor event followed by ecological disturbance. It was enough for most. The truth had no place in common conversation. Even those scientists who knew the most admitted they understood almost nothing. The information recovered from Daniel's memories and the fragments left behind had been parsed by supercomputers, quantum models, even AI beyond civilian awareness. But the result was always the same, an equation that started with emotion, ended in silence, and made sense only to those who had felt it. One of the researchers once asked Daniel if he had regrets. His answer was immediate and honest. No. What happened had taken something from him, his peace, his simplicity, his sense of being a small man in a big world, but it had given him something greater. Purpose. Not grand, heroic purpose. Not destiny. But a simple, heavy truth, that when the unknown came, he had not turned away. He had reached in and pulled it from the water. Not knowing what it was. Not expecting thanks. Just because it was drowning. That act had changed the trajectory of Earth's future. Some signals were received after that day, brief pulses from space, unreadable yet structured. They arrived infrequently, never from the same point twice. Some believed they were responses. Others argued they were unrelated. But each time, Daniel and the Leopard sat outside and listened. No recordings, no analysis. Just presence. As though the universe needed witnesses more than interpreters. The leopard eventually began to fade. Not die. Just fade. Light passed through it more easily. It walked slower, but not weaker. It would sit for hours staring at nothing, or perhaps something only it could perceive. Daniel never tried to stop it. He understood. It had fulfilled its task. The pod was safe. The threat had passed. Its presence on Earth had always been temporary, conditional on the protection of something greater than itself. And now that the bond was made and the message sent, it could rest. On the morning of its disappearance, Daniel found a single pawprint burned into the stone near the edge of the verge. It was not charred but embedded, as though the material itself had accepted the mark willingly. That was the last sign of the creature. It didn't vanish with a sound. It simply ceased. One moment it was lying beside him. The next, only absence. Yet Daniel felt no sorrow. It had not left. It had returned. Years passed. The verge remained stable but unexplained. The surrounding area became a quiet, protected zone. A few artificial intelligence-driven observation centers were installed nearby, yet none ever detected anything unusual. Until the day Daniel died, he lived alone, refusing accolades, interviews, or memoirs. He spoke little, and when he did, his words carried weight like gravity. Local children called him the quiet mountain man, never knowing the weight of the cosmos that had once pressed against his chest. He died without ceremony, asleep in the chair facing the verge. The scientists found him with a faint smile, hands folded, heart stopped. On the table beside him were the words he had written, not as a journal, but as a letter. Not to humanity, but to whoever might one day stand where he had stood. It read, ****. You will not be warned in ways you understand. The test will come in silence, and you may never know you passed. But if you act with compassion, if you do what is right not for glory but because something inside you demands it, the universe will notice. And you will be remembered by those who never speak your name. ****. The government classified the letter. But a copy was left anonymously in the hands of a small child at a local school, years later. That child grew up to be one of Earth's first representatives to an off-world delegation. The events that followed Daniel's quiet heroism echoed throughout history, not with fire, not with conquest, but with trust. When the galaxy eventually opened, when humanity stepped into the stars, it did so without fear. Not because it was the strongest, or the smartest, but because it had proven, in one forgotten forest, that it would save something unknown simply because it was drowning. That legacy could not be erased. It was burned into memory like the pawprint on the stone. A man. A creature. A moment of selfless courage. And the galaxy remembered.